Welcome to the Indie Pub, a laid-back interview show dedicated to the world of self and indie publishing. I'm your host, Jay Rushing, author of the self-published fantasy noir novel Radio, and a beverage buff with a passion for deep dives and good times. Every 2 weeks, a guest will step into the pub with a publishing-related topic and a favorite drink for us to explore and enjoy. Whether you want to sharpen your craft, snag a new cocktail recipe, or just have a laugh, there's always a seat and a full glass waiting for you at the Indie Pub. Welcome to the Indie Pub. Today we have Will Munn and Drew Gerken, two of the creators of the indie tabletop RPG Arium, along with Natasha Entz, who couldn't be here with us today. They're here with us to talk about Arium and what it took to build it from an idea to the Kickstarter success that it is. But before we dive in, tell us a little bit about what we're drinking in the pub today.
That's a great question, Jim. I have in front of me here a really kind of earthy, tasty Rooibos chai tea with oat milk.
Let's talk about Arium. And just as a baseline, can you give us a bit of an overview of what exactly Arium is?
Yeah. So Arium is a role-playing game, a tabletop role-playing game that, it's, I guess, how do you describe that? It's like Dungeons and Dragons. That's the example that people know, right?
Yeah.
So it's like Dungeons and Dragons. A bunch of people get together around a table together, usually, unless it's the world that we live in today. And in that case, you get around a Zoom channel together, right? Or something like that. And you have dice and you have paper and you have pencils or pens or whatever your preference is. And you, create a story together with characters and things like that. It's kind of funny because I played role-playing games for a long time when I was a kid and when I was in college. And then I didn't for a long time until I started looking to get into writing novels. And then I found that tons and tons of authors play role-playing games. And I was like, wow, it would be great to get back into that. And I did. And then, at a certain point, started actually writing for them.
So I am very, very, very green when it comes to tabletop RPGs. If you need someone to build the longest road in Catan, I am your guy. I can do that. But I've played D&D maybe 3 times ever. And I know Arium isn't D&D, but could you explain to a newbie like me some of the ways Arium differs from other tabletop RPGs?
You want to start? You want to take that, Drew?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that one of the easiest things to say is that Arium is a very rules-light, narrative-focused tabletop role-playing game. The emphasis around the entire game is to create an amazing world and tell an awesome story within that. And while that's totally possible in Dungeons and Dragons, and people do it every single day, there is a much larger focus on combat rules and those sorts of things in Dungeons and Dragons. Not that you can't have combat in Arium, it's just handled completely differently. D&D has so many supplemental books from the base game, and most of those books contain rules for how to make your character's class stronger, the different abilities and powers that they gain, and the vast majority of those are focused around combat situations, which is awesome for people who love to, maybe rack up minis on a table and roll handfuls of dice and slay the monster and all of that. Arium is more focused on the story aspect, and while combat can be a part of it, or conflict resolution can be a part of it, it's sort of just done with a quick shake of the dice and something cool that your character is able to do, and then you move on with the story. So I would say that's a pretty big differentiator, at least in my mind.
So would you say that the story is kind of filling in for a lot of that combat, or is it just taking it in a completely different direction?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's up to the group, right? And
Gotcha.
And every group is pretty different. My old D&D group that I played, sort of like Will, I played when I was young through my adolescent years and my early teenage years, and I left it, and I came back and started playing with a group of guys that I was bouncing at a bar with. And so it was
Nice.
like at that point it was fun to have combat, but we had a really narrative focused campaign, and really there are some groups that love telling an awesome story even in Dungeons and Dragons or any of the other thousands of role-playing game systems out there. But there are some groups that really just want to roll handfuls of dice and see the numbers and kill the baddie and gain the loot, and that's what satisfies them. And that's just as valid as someone who's looking to tell like a character or a narrative-driven story.
Now, I know that creation is a big ticket item with Arium. I know that that's one of its major selling points. Can you talk a little bit about the extra freedom that Arium provides people in the realm of creation?
Yeah. Arium is by default a game with very streamlined and slick elements for building a world together as a group. There are plenty of games out there that do this. Not nearly as many as there are games that are more like D&D, I think, but there are quite a few games out there that do this. And most of them focus on individuals' contributions, right? So you come into a game and somebody's going to say, all right, tell us what, your understanding of this world is. Tell us about this location, right? And then one person will give their view on that location, and then that becomes part of the canon for the world, for the story, right? Arium's approach is much more democratic, I guess, is probably a way to put it, okay. Where everybody is coming up with ideas together, right? A whole lot of ideas, and they don't all become part of canon for the world, for the story. It depends on people to make those decisions. So there's some conversations and back and forth, right? You do some combination of things. We'll probably talk about that more later. But eventually, people are going to vote, and then the top ideas make it in. And the beautiful thing about that is it keeps that process simple. It doesn't put all the weight on one person to figure out what makes that creation great. And everybody tends to like what comes out of it a lot.
Nice. Now, is that creative aspect of it, is it similar to D&D in that it's you kind of create and then play, or is the creation a part of the play?
It's a little bit of both, I think. A little both,
okay.
Yeah, but we do have a very strong, so you have kind of a session zero type of thing or something like that where, so Arium is 2 books right now. We have one called Arium Create and one called Arium Discover. And Create is all about building the world together, and Discover is all about playing in the world.
All right, so many of my listeners are going to have at least some idea of the way that books get published, whether traditional or by self or indie means. But I highly doubt that many people have an in to the world of indie publishing a TTRPG. So could you kind of walk us through those steps and stages?
Yeah, I think that's a pretty interesting process, and there are different ways to approach it. But we chose the crowdfunding method, right, as kind of our way to get funds in order to create a game and to publish it. I think there's a little bit higher expense, generally speaking, to create an indie TTRPG than there is a novel, because you have to have quite a bit more art. Art is a pretty integral part of most role-playing games, and so we have quite a bit of art, and then the layout is more complex, right, than a novel. End to end, I'd say you have to have a concept. You have to put that concept in front of people and try it out and see, how it works and if people enjoy it and what you want to change, right? Play test. And then once you have a fairly solid thing, then I guess you go out and you look for art and you look for some other things that could be beneficial. I would suggest going out and doing actual play games and streaming them on the internet, or recording in advance and publishing them, either way, so that people can start to see it right before you launch a crowdfunding campaign. And then you prep a crowdfunding campaign, which that's no small step, but you do that, and then hopefully get it out to enough people to raise enough money to make the rest of the book. That's kind of it. And then after that, you've got to go through editing. You've got to go through all the components that you would go through for a normal indie publishing, right? You've got to do layout. You've got to do printing. You have to source a printer, and then fulfillment at that point. And that's where we are right now. We actually fulfilled all of our physical books just last week.
Oh, congrats. That's a big feat. So how was Arium born? Like what's its origin story?
I want Drew to tell that.
Well, I think it's really important to note that Arium pulls some of its methodology for the Arium Create session from sort of like agile lean methodology for project planning and that sort of stuff.
For people who might not know, is that planning methodology for games, or does that come from the professional world?
Yeah, that's actually from the corporate world. It's a practice that Will uses a lot with his teams in the corporate world, and so really in running some of these meetings or being in meetings that Will ran, where you're putting Post-it notes all over a whiteboard or a wall, and you're voting on things that should have the highest priority that you should focus your attention on in the workplace. We had a small writing group at work that we would meet after hours and that sort of thing and get together. And one night I just said, man, what if we just sort of tried a writing prompt where we do this sort of methodology and create a world together, and then we can all write a short story or two within that. Whatever we create, we'll kind of write it. And so we sat down and we just started talked about like, well, what were the things we would need? Well, we would need to know, what sort of setting or genre it is. We need to know, is there magic? Is there not? What kind of cultures? All of that. And we just kind of came up with a loose framework, and then we went round by round and started with the broadest of strokes and got a little bit more granular every step of the way. And then we had this really cool world, and we went and we wrote short stories in there and kind of brought them back and shared them with people. And that was sort of where the idea started. Fast forward many months, and I had a after work D&D game going on, and the group sort of got the group got bored with the world that I've been creating for about 15 years in my D&D dungeon master experience. They just, all of the really amazing things that exist in my mind did not translate, and the interest level wasn't there. And that's the story of countless dungeon masters and game masters that live in the TTRPG space, right? Is that usually, like Will mentioned to like he alluded to earlier, usually the dungeon master creates the world and the ideas, unless you're using published supplemental work like Dungeons and Dragons has Forgotten Realms and all of these different worlds that they write and publish the books, and that takes the creative process. Like that alleviates that for people who don't want to go through that. But a lot of dungeon masters get into DMing because they want to create the world in which the story is being told. So my world had finally fallen flat. My group was like, all right, we're done. We want to do something different. And I said, okay, I had this really cool writing prompt thing that we did with our writers group. I wonder if I could do the same sort of thing and we could create a world to play D&D in together. And we did, and it was this like ruined land where nature had started to fight back, and portals to the Fey realm were opening, and nice. And really like the Raven Queen was coming back to reclaim her land that civilization had started to ruin, and it was just a really awesome setting. And for as tropey as it may be, and for the things that were not fully filled in, every single player at the table loved it. And as soon as we got done going through this process, they wanted to play right then and there. We didn't have characters made, and they're like, screw it, we'll create character sheets later. We just want to start telling the story. And that was sort of the light bulb moment for me anyways, in which I then handed it off to Will and told him about it. And that is really sort of, I think, when Will's engine started to rev up a little bit and start thinking about this as not a writing prompt, but an actual product that people could use and love.
How much gameplay went on before you made the final decision to move forward with making this as an actual product?
There was some. So some of these, like Drew mentioned, right, we had some of these exercises where we built worlds or, and we also took it on the road to some conventions, right, and said, hey, let's just go run a session where we'll build world with whoever comes to the panel or whatever, right? And so we did that, and that was, after a couple of those times, and Drew's experience running it for his or an early version of it, I guess, for his group, right? I think that's when kind of the light came on that it was something that we wanted to do. Then at that point, it was like, okay, well, what do you need to have in order to make this into a game, right? Because there's a difference between, a game and, just a fun thing you can do with your friends sometimes, right?
Yeah.
And so, we had to figure out how to add that aspect to it and make it, balanced enough so that, if there are people in the group that don't agree on how to go about it, that they can, get along together and figure out how to work together. And guidance for, whoever's going to facilitate and all those types of things. But the other part of it was, if it was going to be a game, then it needed to have rules for role playing, right? Yeah. It needed to have its own rules for role playing. Otherwise, it's not really a complete game. At least it didn't feel like it to me. And so, we started looking at some different games that existed that had like a world building component. Like we played Microscope and we played some other, some Fate and some different games like that have some of that aspect. And found that we really did, I think, have a niche, right? Something that someone hadn't already done. Mm-hmm. And so then we needed those rules to kind of go with it to help the role-playing aspect. And that's where Natasha actually came in. So she had come to one of those early events at a convention, right? And helped build the world for that. And I think she and Drew were there promoting a podcast that they were kicking off at the time.
Oh, nice.
And so they knew each other, and we chatted a little bit afterwards, and she had, like, I chatted with her, offline later on, and she had this set of rules that she had been developing for, I don't know if I probably shouldn't spoil whatever it is in case she wants to still do this at some point, but she has a really cool idea for an RPG that she hasn't made. And she had these rules, and they just kind of mapped perfectly onto what I was envisioning for Arium, which wasn't its name at the time, but, it kind of was all kismet.
All right, well, let's get back to our tea real quickly. And let's talk a little bit about what we're drinking, talk about the taste, the smells, the specific notes that we're picking up, things like that. So, Will, why don't you start? What brand of tea? What's your tea called?
Yeah, so mine is Harney and Sons. Okay. I think they're out of the Pacific Northwest here in the States. Okay. And they do... So they do loose leaf teas, but they also do like a really fine silk netting type of bag with the loose leaf just in it, and it's really nice. Like, it's very, very nice. The flavors are always, they never feel stale or anything like that. And so I love I have several different teas of theirs actually, and I buy it in bulk, but. Yeah, this one is really, it's got, sort of that nice earthy taste that you expect, I think, if you've had this kind of tea before. And I love chai, right? Since the first time I had a chai tea at an Indian restaurant ages ago, it just, those spices and flavors just mix really well. The only thing I would wish for this drink is that instead of using, like a lower fat oat milk, that I could just use whole freaking cream in it. But my doctor says I'm not supposed to do that. So, yeah.
Is it speaking of some of those spices, what are some of the key spices in the blend you have?
That is a good question. I believe there's actually saffron in this blend.
Oh, okay.
And then, but not a lot of citrus. So it's mostly like, there isn't any citrus, I don't think, in this one. I tried the one that you recommended to me, and I noted some citrus in there. Yeah. Some other things, but there's no citrus in this one. It's all like powdered spices that you'd probably get from Asia, right?
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Oh, you were able to find the one that I'm drinking over there in the States.
I did. Yeah, I have.
Oh,
that
great.
One too. Yeah, I tried it the other day. It's really good.
Cool. I thought it was only the German area of the world, so that's great to hear.
It wasn't easy to get, but I did get some. Yeah.
My brother's a tea guy. I'll have to tell him he can actually find it. All right, Drew, how about you? What are you drinking?
Yeah. Well, I'm still I'm here on the Rooibos train as well. But I went left where you went right with your chai. So, and forgive me because I'm not the biggest of tea guys, and so I had this. I got this really cool sample pack of tea from a company called August. I don't know how they actually pronounce it, but their whole thing is creating uncommon tea. So they take all these different types of tea and they make these really cool flavor profiles, these really exotic flavor profiles. And so the one that I'm drinking is called Biarritz. And it is a velvety rooibos with amaretto and orange blossom. And so I am a huge amaretto fan, and I can go either way. I can go amaretto and orange or amaretto and cherry. Either way, I just love the flavor. There's South African rooibos, there's anise and almond, lemon peel, orange blossom, star anise, a little bit of like flavoring and sugar in there just to sweeten it up a little bit. But it's pretty fantastic.
Does it have just a little bit of a licorice flavor to it then?
Yeah, there is. There's just a little underpinning of licorice from the star anise in there. So it's
Nice.
it's pretty nice, and it's really mellow. It's not overpowering, and it's definitely, like they say, it's velvety, and that's exactly what it feels like when you're drinking it. So it's fantastic.
That sounds amazing. I'm with you on not being a huge tea person. And I feel like it's one of the most disappointing aspects of my life, because here is a world filled with just thousands upon thousands of flavors. And I strike out so often. Every once in a while, like this one that I'll describe in a sec is fantastic. And then there's a brand, I think they're either British or Australian, but it's called T2, like the letter T and 2. And they have one, oddly enough, New York again, but it's called New York Breakfast. So it's like an English breakfast, but it tastes like pancakes. And I don't know how they do it because it doesn't have any funkiness in it. It's all just done with spices and tea, but it is fantastic. And so I know that's buried somewhere out there are teas that I love. It's a bit of a hard time finding them. Well, the one I have is Tikana's New York Chai. Tikana is a pretty common tea brand we have over here. This one specifically is a honey lemon variety, and it's just everything you'd expect. One thing I find with Rooibos, I have such a hard time pronouncing that, is it has enough vanilla taste on its own. I don't know if you've noticed this, but sometimes they'll add more to it, and it feels like it just wrecks it. And this one, the vanilla comes through really, really well, but they haven't added any, and I really appreciate that. All right, let's get back to Arium. What about the process, whether it be the creation of it or the producing of it, the distribution of it, what was one or more of the most surprising aspects of that journey?
My favorite part of this entire process has been Will and I and a couple people sitting around going, this is a cool idea, this is fun, like we could push this further, and then doing it and have, like, I'm not exaggerating when I say that every of the countless play tests we've run, everyone has left amazed by what they've created and dying to tell stories and play games in that world. And that's, I mean, it's just proof positive. And I get a little emotional about it, to be completely honest, because we knew we had something. We just didn't know really what it was until we started putting it in front of people. And I just, like, yeah, we get feedback like, hey, you should tweak this, or this part doesn't really make a ton of sense. And we've done that. We've tweaked it and all of that. But nobody's left going, this world sucks. I hate what we created. Everyone has just wanted to stop playtesting and start playing, right? Which is, I think, probably the highest compliment we could get. The other thing that I'm just going to call out as part of this collaborative spirit, this world building thing, this group oriented, everybody has a voice, everybody has input, was honestly the nights that Will and Natasha and I were sitting around tables, brainstorming rules, brainstorming the name of the game. We came up with Arium through the exact same process that Arium uses to create worlds. We put out a bunch of ideas. We voted on it, and Arium is the one that won out. And so I just love that the system we've built was using the same rules in which of the system that we created. I don't know if that makes perfect sense, but it's a pretty cool engine that we have going here.
And as a bystander who's gotten to kind of watch this whole thing progress, that's something I noticed. In the beginning, it's like, oh man, somebody reviewed it, or someone's got something to say about it. Let me go read it. It's like, oh wow, that was a fantastic review. And then after a while, it got to the point where I was just like, okay, what kind of fantastic review are they going to get this time? It has seemed so positive over and over again. It's been absolutely great.
Yeah, I would say that's definitely a something that caught me by surprise, and it did for quite a while. Right, we'd go and take it to somebody else, and I'm like, boy, I hope they like it. I really hope they like it. And he's right, they did. Right, and it quit. It's still thrilling though, right? When somebody says, here's the thing that you built and we love it. Yeah. Right, it's still thrilling. It never stops being thrilling. At least I hope it doesn't. Maybe work becomes less fun if that's the case, but one of the things that for me was harder than I thought it would be, and this is probably just my ignorance showing through, right? As a new indie publisher of role-playing games, I took on the responsibility of art direction for this game, and that was really challenging, especially in the beginning, because I had no idea where to look, how to contact artists, how to find people, right? How to get something that, like our covers, for example, right? And this is probably the hardest part. We went through so many different iterations on how to do a cover for this game, right? Because it's not genre specific, really, right? It's very open, and it can be anything. It can be anything that somebody can imagine. Right. It's not tied to fantasy. It's not tied to, science fiction or, post-apocalyptic or anything. Right. And so I just kept looking. I just kept looking and looking and trying to find, something or to, have an idea. But how do you represent possibility? Right. How do you represent possibility on a cover? And that's a very difficult question to answer. And yeah, and I think some games have done that by saying, well, we're going to have basically a really blank cover with a cool logo, right?
Yeah.
And I think that works, right? But we wanted something with art, right? And this is what we ended up with, right? Eventually, and I don't know if hopefully folks will be able to see the cover, but they turned out really well, and man, I'm glad we went through the fight, I think, to get there. But yeah, it was surprisingly difficult.
Did you have one artist you worked with or a whole bunch?
So we have one artist for the cover. So there are actually 3 covers for this game. Because eventually there'll be a 3rd book. Okay. But right now there's only 2 books, and so we have 2 covers. And it's actually one continuous piece of art. So the books, if you lay them out next to each other, they can be like a triptych, right?
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah. But yeah, so we worked with one artist for that, Andreas Rocha, and I'm probably butchering his name. He's Portuguese, lives in Lisbon, and he's phenomenal. Really love the art that he put together for this. And then the interior art is all by an Southeast Asian artist named Tithi Luadathong, which I'm probably also mispronouncing horribly, which is all very, very beautiful. And most of it is actually stock art, which we paid for, obviously, but but it's that. But there was a really consistent theme among this artist's work that we really liked and stuck with throughout all the books for the interiors. Nice. And we feel like it helps players to see, sort of get that sense of possibility.
Nice. Have that kind of consistent through thread. So what then would you have done differently? Because there has to be something. This is such a huge project.
I'll hit it first. If you've got something to add to, Drew, I'm curious what your thoughts are on that. But from my standpoint, I think, there's always things you can do better or differently, right? But one thing for me that was really difficult is that we kind of got the inspiration for this project when I had already committed to do another project previously. And so we had like kind of a big hiatus in the middle where I wasn't doing very much on this project as I was very focused on, and I'll just say it's Zorro, the role-playing game by Gallant Knight Games, which is a fantastic game, by the way. And not because I worked on it, but because all the people who did work on it did a really, really great job. And it's beautiful. And if you like Zorro, it's awesome. But that was a big project. And that's like it's done like a AAA role-playing game, right? It's a beautiful hardcover book, full cover, 200 pages, right? I mean, it's big. This was a big, big project. It's definitely the biggest one I've ever worked on. And so while that was going on, I was kind of sidelining anything to do with Arium, and it was taking a backseat for the most part, for me anyway. But I will say this, that the experience taught me a lot that then did become really valuable in producing the final version of Arium.
Drew?
Yeah, I've been racking my brain here a little bit. But I think that, this is like, it's a learning and growing process. And I think it's just as much on the personal side as it is the professional and the creative side as well. One thing that I've been guilty of many times in my life is falling in love with an idea, and then not wanting that to change in any way, shape, or form. And so I would just say that especially at the very beginning when we were like really ramping up and thinking that this was an awesome idea, it was, it's the old kill your darling sort of thing. Yeah. Like we went through so many different iterations of this that there were many, many times where frustrations and that sort of thing mounted with me because it was not the original thing that we had come up with, and it was changing and all of that. And if I'm being 100% candid, like Natasha coming into the mix and adding the rules set of things for what is now Arium Discover, the actual mechanical system to play the game and all of that. I was like, this is mine and Will's baby. I don't want anybody else involved. And that's just my hard-headedness and my stubbornness and my inability to let other people in to allow something to grow. And in hindsight, it was stupid. Arium is 1,000 times better game than it was when it started, and that's because of Natasha, and that's because of the three of us letting everybody who play tested it in to give feedback and listen and make tweaks and dare I say, let it evolve. So that was a big growing process for me, and I definitely came out much, much better for it on the other side of the project, for sure.
It's really interesting hearing a lot of this, just because, part of the reason why I have you guys on today is so many of the kind of parallel ways of doing things that come into play from writing or game creation. And it really boils down to project creation. Whether you're painting a painting or writing a book or creating a tabletop RPG, it's so many of the same thing. Killing your darlings, right? Like you mentioned that. So many of the same struggles and tasks that you have before you are the same, regardless of what the project is. So with Arium, do you have to be a previous TTRPG player, or at least have a bit of a background in that to be able to jump in efficiently? Or is this the type of game that anybody can just stroll in and hit the ground running?
I think the role playing aspect of it, it could be beneficial to have somebody with you who's done role playing before.
Gotcha.
But the world building part, I think anybody could just pick that up and do it, right? It doesn't have to be, you don't have to have any special talent or anything like that. And we have videos of, of people playing and going through those processes online. And so you can go look at those on, the Adept Icarus YouTube site, or, there are a lot of other ones out there as well, but where people can see folks actually playing and see how it works for them. So I think for the most part, yeah, anybody could probably pick it up. It's not written for someone who's an expert.
Gotcha. Okay.
That makes sense.
You've done a ton of play testing, and you've obviously played this a million times. What are some of your favorite incarnations that have come up? What are some of the best worlds you've gotten to explore with the game?
I think my favorite one is always the most recent. I mean, they're all great. Yeah, they're all great. I've never, like Drew mentioned, right? We've played this with a lot of people, and folks always want to play it. They always enjoy what they created, and that includes us, right? So we built a lot of worlds and had a lot of sessions with tons and tons of people over the last couple of years, and I've never had one that I disliked, right? I liked them all. I think let's see, the one that we built as a community exercise, as part of the Kickstarter. Like we decided that, for promotional or whatever, we'd just say, hey, anybody who wants to join in, we'll build an Arium together and we'll do it disconnected, right? So we didn't actually get on a Zoom call together. We didn't actually get, in a room together or anything like that. We had people just posting ideas out to an online board where we could go through them, and going through that process. And we built this really neat world together where it's a planet and it's an amusement park. Nice. The entire planet is an amusement park. Minus 80 acres or something, right? Like a square mile that's just green, bucolic landscape where, Anne of Green Gables lives or something, right? I mean, it's but this planet-wide amusement park is, full of adventure and opportunities, because it behind the scenes, feeding off the emotions, the terror, the thrills, the fun, is an eldritch entity, right? Mm. That is, growing in power slowly over time. And there are, the park maintenance people are running around, and they're, probably cultists, and there's all kinds of stuff happening. So that was really fun to create. And we also decided to make a book out of it, with some adventure seeds and a full-on multi-page adventure and some fiction, and yeah, so we're gonna be publishing that pretty soon. Nice. And I love it. I think it's really fun. Drew did some writing for it that's just fantastic.
Thanks, man.
Yeah.
How about you, Drew? Do you have any? Obviously, this world is a pretty great one, but do you have any others? Any space western cooking shows or something really out there?
Yeah, I mean, so there's a couple that come to mind, and it's this is probably the hardest question to answer for me, because every single idea has been unique and has been really cool. And so one of the ones that I want to play the most is actually a Arium Create session I wasn't even involved in, and basically the tagline for it is Cyberpunk Vikings, right? And I'm just I want to play that game so bad.
That sounds fantastic.
But one of our, actually we did a play test. Will, Natasha, myself, and some friends, we did a play test, and this is the night that Arium got its name, because Will and Natasha and I afterwards, we sort of were going through the feedback and talking about things, and Will's like, all right, we got to put a name on this game. But we did one that the tagline is basically Alice in Wonderland underwater. And so the world is like this complete trippy, surreal thing that all happens in this aquatic world, where, like, I think if I remember correctly, the world itself is like water, right? And everything happens below the surface instead of above the surface. And it was late. We were getting silly, and we were totally channeling our Lewis Carroll naming like the Jabberwock, and we just had these really like boisterous names and titles and just made up gibberish, and it was a freaking blast, man. It was so much fun. That one, I think, probably stands out as like the most evocative in my mind, just because of how surreal everything sort of came out. And it was it was a blast, because we, you know, it's as part of the process, everyone feeds off of each other. And what that means is the end product is going to be different than what you start with, in terms of tone and flavor. A lot of times, where you could have a group of diehard D&D players, and they want to be playing in a fantasy world with dragons and sorcerers and all of that. And I promise you, it will be different than they intend by the time the process is done. And this one started out a little bit serious, and then, you know, I was just, you know, like when we're naming cultures and organizations and people in all these different stages, I just started making crap up, man. I was tired, I was loopy, and I just started making up the weirdest stuff you could think of. And the whole group just sort of fed on it, and it just, and it wasn't just me, but I just remember like writing stuff down and cracking myself up for the gibberish I was writing, and it was getting voted through, and then other people started doing it. So that's probably my favorite create session I've ever been in.
So what advice would you give other people who are thinking about creating their own TTRPG from scratch?
I mean, I'd say don't be afraid of it, right?
That's good.
There are a lot of different styles of TTRPGs, right? I think if someone looks at a game like Dungeons and Dragons and says, "Well, I can never make something like that," well, that's fine, right? There's a whole team of people that work on Dungeons and Dragons, right? A very large team.
Yeah.
And that doesn't mean that you can't create a way for people to have fun telling stories together, right?
Yeah.
And whether that involves, you know, maybe it could be almost primarily combat, and maybe it's more like a board game, right, at that point. Or maybe, you know, I guess I would pick something to focus on, though, right?
Yeah.
What's the catch, right? So either, and I never actually expected to make, and I'm going to use the word, I will use the word because this is the time to use it. I don't think I used it ever in any of our marketing or anywhere because I hate this word, but I never expected to make a generic role-playing game. That's what Arium is, right? It's generic, but I mean settingless, I guess. Role-playing game is probably a better way to put it. But I mean, if you pick some sort of setting, I think that's an easier way to go, right? Mm-hmm. And then you can start to think about, you know, what are the things that are important about this setting and how do I help evoke that during gameplay, right? And I've got other projects that, you know, have more that type of bent to them. I think that's probably a better place to start. Another thing you can potentially do is there are some open license game systems out there, right? Okay. And you can pick up an open license game system and, you know, meld it to the needs of your setting, right? Gotcha. And I think that's a good potential way to start. Another way to go, I'll do one more example and then I'll let Drew talk, is you start very small, right? Make, you know, say I'm going to make a 200 word RPG or a 1-page RPG, right? Something like that. And that creative focus that provides, I think helps a lot. And it's similar with writing, right? They tell you to start out writing, you know, short stories or flash or something like that because it helps to focus you, right? Yeah. And you get rid of the things that aren't necessary. And I think that's a really good way to start with writing role-playing games as well.
Yeah, I I don't know. I'm not the expert here, right? I consider myself much more of a writer than a game designer. I mean, really, Will and Natasha handled so much of the mechanical side of things and all of that. It's not that I want to get in there and explore that space and push myself for sure, but I just consider myself sort of a writer that happens to write in the TTRPG world right now. What I would say is, excuse me, I would say, one, find your hedgehog. I'm throwing out all these business terms, right? So find your hedgehog. Like, what are you passionate about that you can do well and make money at? And I really think that the Arium's a perfect example of a hedgehog for me, because I love world building and I love that process, and I love creating a space where there's possibility, and that you can just go and play around in and think up a character and think up a storyline and plug in some villains and have a hell of a good time. So the world building thing is just sort of one of the things that I've kind of hung my hat on for a long time, even in my fiction writing. The world in which I tell my stories is usually way more interesting than the story I'm trying to write, right? So that's why I'm writing for role-playing games and not novels right now, right? Just because I'm still working on that part of it. I would also just say, like, well, one other thing I wanted to call out is playtesting, right? Playtest, playtest, and then when you think you've got it, playtest some more. What I do see a lot with crowdfunded projects, and then there's a big annual push for something called Zine Quest or Zine Quest, depending on how you pronounce it, which is all about these like little micro RPGs. There is a very, very obvious difference between someone who has a cool idea and puts it down on paper and throws it up to be crowdfunded versus someone who has put thought into the finished product and has sought feedback and input from others. And the business side of me it just says, like, it doesn't matter how cool you think your product is. People in the market need to validate it, and then you need to put out a high quality thing, because if you put out junk that isn't play tested, you haven't paid for an editor, you haven't thought about the bells and whistles, you're damaging your reputation and your credibility in the space, right? So while I never had my neck on the line, I just got to put words on paper for Will, and it's Will's name, it's his reputation, it's Adept Icarus's thing. I still thought about, like, are these words that I'm handing off to him something that I'm proud of, that I want my name signed to, and that I think would uphold Will's intent for the quality of the product that he's publishing. And so just anyone who's trying to start out, just understand that rushing a product will probably have a greater negative impact on your future success than taking the time to do it well and correctly.
Yeah, I think there's a little bit of balance there for sure, right? Mm-hmm. Where you have to say, how good is good enough? Because that's an important side of it as well.
Yeah.
Because we could have noodled on it even longer than we did, but I think we came to a point where, and there were a lot of delays in getting this project to Kickstarter. We wanted to have it at the point where when we got it to Kickstarter, that we could meet whatever commitment it was we made to get things to backers. Right. Mm-hmm. That was our goal. And so that run-up time to preparing for the Kickstarter was far longer than the time between the Kickstarter and delivery, right? Kickstarter and delivery is like 4 months.
Yeah.
Five. But before that, right, there was a lot of work that went into it prior.
How long would you say that was?
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess if you exclude the Zorro time, it's probably about a year.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, all right, fellas, it's last call here at the Indie Pub. Can you give an indie published game or two as a recommendation to our listeners?
Well, wow. I would recommend Microscope to people. I mean, I think it's a really neat take on world building for an RPG that's really fun. You're not so much building a world that you turn around and role play in, I guess. I mean, sort of you are, but a little different. In that you're more building a history of a world, right?
Okay.
And that's It's really fun. It's neat. I enjoyed it a lot. Let me go into some of the Zine Quest stuff that Drew mentioned. There was a really neat Zine Quest game that came out a couple years ago, and had the opportunity to play it at Halloween. I think not this year, but the year before, called Mothership, which it's like a horror space sci-fi type of game. And it's really beautiful. It's a really cool looking, very compelling game. And it's fun too. And then third and final, because I need one more. Yeah, I'll go to Tiny D6. So if you're looking for something in a particular setting that's pretty simple, you could pick it up and play it in an hour at a con, right? You could introduce your children to role playing with it, which I have done. Tiny D6 is a system created by Gallant Knight Games. They have a lot of different settings. They have, Tiny Dungeon, which is sort of like Dungeons and Dragons. They have Tiny Frontiers, which is space or sci-fi based. They have Tiny Wastelands, which is post-apocalyptic. They have Tiny Supers, which is, comic book heroes, and they're all really, really well done. Like the art is great, the writing is fantastic, and the system is just nice and simple, right? But still allows you to like, their Supers game is honestly, I think, my favorite of any Supers RPG, because you can make any kind of super with this game, like any kind you can imagine, right? But it's so easy, and I love that about it.
To be honest, I collect more games than I play. So I have I'm looking through here, and I have this huge stack of like Kickstarter RPGs and all of that. This is an example. I know that most people aren't, or maybe nobody will see the video, but there is a from Zine Quest, I think last year, there is a game called Artifact, and the whole game is about it's about a magic item. Like, you create a magic item and you tell the story of the item's history, how it came into existence, its exploits, it's how it got its powers. It's not only is the concept amazing, because sentient magic items are just cool as shit anyways, but the production quality on it is exactly what I'm talking about, and like, knowing what your end goal is and how you want to present the game is just as important as getting the game published or in production, right? You got to know what your end product is, and it's really well done. It has like gold ink printing, and it's just like, it feels like the game you're going to play. When you look at it, you're like, okay, it's, it's silk, it's printed, right? But it's layered printing. So there's blacks and grays, and then there's gold overlay on top of it to accent. It's just, it's a beautiful piece of production from some guy in his house, right? Or some person. It's from called Mousehole Press is their publishing company. So I think that one is really cool. I love the concept. I love the production quality of it, and I love everything about it. Finally,
that one. I almost mentioned that one. Like, I have it too.
Artifact is cool. I would say that the Great American Line by Christopher Gray is another really thing. So he started with a game called The Great American Novel, and then recently put out The Great American Witch, and these are very like focused on sort of, like classic literature based storytelling almost. And I've played The Great American Witch a few times, and it is an absolute blast. And the reviews and everything that I've heard people talk about The Great American Novel is just how remarkable it is. But The Great American Witch I can specifically vouch for in being a fantastic game, well thought out, very, very well designed, and has some really cool, like, new things that I haven't seen in a lot of other games. But again, I'm like a really narrative driven person, right? I'm all about the story and I'm all about the background. So these sorts of games sort of resonate with me.
All right, guys. So tell the listeners what you've got going, both with Arium and with yourselves, and where they can find you.
So again, my name is Drew Gerken. You can find me as WordDrew, WORDREW, Twitter, Instagram. My current projects are really sort of, I'm now back in the beginning stages with a couple of game ideas that I have that I'm sort of. There's a really cool Kickstarter that happened for a cyberpunk game, and this group came out and kickstarted a game called Axon Punk, and it is cyberpunk where hip hop is the main music versus like techno and heavy metal and all of that, right? Mm-hmm. So I mean, it got my wheels turning of like, whoa, okay, there's a market for more RPGs that have like a hip hop flavor to it. So I'm actually working on the concept for a game that will be driven by powered by the Apocalypse engine. So as Will talks about, where there's these open gaming licenses where you can use someone else's mechanicals and create your idea around it. That's the plan there, where you get together as like a hip hop group, and your story arc is basically like hustling mixtapes on the street to getting your first deal to becoming a mogul, right? In the empire. So that's one I'm playing on, that I'm tinkering around with. My whiteboard back there is full of notes for it. But also I have dipped my toe in the waters of custom dice making and like resin casting and custom dice. And so be on the lookout for Mythmaker dice in the near future when I start opening up my Instagram and stuff like that with resin casted dice. Hopefully that'll end up panning out. But as I mentioned earlier, I really fancy myself as a collector of hobbies. So I just these things sound cool, so I dive in and I try them, and some stick and some just cost me lots of money and then live in a Tupperware box in my garage for a Rubbermaid box, for years. So we'll see what happens. But, just writing and obviously always noodling on the novel side of things, the fiction side of things, but also looking for opportunities to write for other games as well as a freelancer or as a, co-designer, co-writer, whatever.
So, as I think we mentioned, Adept Icarus is my publishing company. So you can find anything you want to know about what we're doing at adepticarus.com. Follow Adept Icarus on Twitter. We have an Adept Icarus Facebook page, right? It's around. So if you search for that, you'll find us for sure. Also, if you want to follow random tweets about gaming and things like that, then you can follow my personal Twitter account, which is at WLMunn. For any of our Kickstarter backers who are listening, we're working on your books. So there are some stretch goals that we unlocked as part of the campaign, and those are in varying states of completion right now. We met our initial goal to kind of deliver physical books. We actually had a goal to deliver them by the end of February, but we were about a week into March, I think, by the time we got them all shipped, because we added a little bit of extra stuff to discover. And I think it was worth an extra week's wait. Personally, I think it's worth way more than a week's wait. Some really great tables and cool toolkit stuff from Diogo Nogueira, which is amazing. So we're working on... I mentioned it earlier. It's called Arcadia Planetary Amusement and Recreation Kingdom. I said all of that and I didn't have to look it up, so that's a win in my book. Yeah. So it's it's a little splat book. It's system agnostic. I mean, it'll have some stuff in it that could be applied to Arium for sure, but it's, you could run it with any RPG system if you wanted to. It's just a little setting book with some adventure stuff and hooks and things like that in it. We also have Arium Flash, which is like our big installment in Arium that we that we really kind of promoted as part of the Kickstarter. And this is a super cool book where we have all sorts of authors from all over the world who, some of them are, folks who've written for RPGs for ages. Some of them are, published authors. One is a New York Times bestselling author. And then, some people who probably you haven't heard of before that we wanted to give a shot at writing some stuff in an RPG and getting published. That book, Arium Flash, is full of story seeds that are modular. They're kind of like Mad Libs, right? But they're built for Ariums. And so as part of the world creation process for Arium Create, you come up with, certain types of things that are elements of that world. And these story seeds have spots where you can slot those things in, right? And they're all themed. So you have, like we have neo-noir as an example. We have, high fantasy. We have a Western. We have, and there are 5 seeds of each of these types, basically. And the book is huge. It's actually our biggest book. It's going to be, I think it's going to be like 80, 90 pages. Oh, wow. And so it's just full of all these ideas for story seeds that an Arium GM can just pick up and run with, right? And so, group builds a world. Maybe it's something that you're not that familiar with. Maybe you've never watched a noir movie, right? And so you don't really know what the sense of that might look like. Well, pick up one of these seeds, plug in some items, and you could be off and running with the story, with the group right away. And then you can go do your research before you play the next game, right? So that one's coming very soon. That's actually top of the priority list. Then Arcadia, and then we also have a book called Arium Bridge, which is probably actually going to be 3 volumes. One for what we're calling a bridge to 5e, which helps people convert Ariums to work with Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. One called Bridge to Fate, which allows, same thing for Fate RPG. And then the third one is Bridge to Tiny D6. As I mentioned, we love Tiny D6, and we want folks to be able to take their Ariums and play them with Tiny D6. So those are the 3, and I probably shouldn't talk about anything else, but I'm going to give you one more. Which will be the next major project, and we'll probably run a Kickstarter for it too, which is Arium Evolve, which is just a really neat book that's full of all kinds of ideas, how to, change the world, change your characters, change the rules, and everything of an Arium game, and really kind of customize it to however you want it to be. And so we're pretty excited about that, and we already have the cover for it, obviously. So, yeah, that'll be next. Maybe later this year, we'll run a Kickstarter for that.
Thanks everyone for tuning in to the Indie Pub. If you like what you hear, consider giving us a like and subscribe so you won't miss any of our indie investigations or boozy banter. I've been your host, Jay Rushing, and we'll see you back in the pub next time.